Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Gail Mandel, and I'm the Chief Operating and Advancement Officer here at the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. And on behalf of our board and our staff, it's my pleasure to welcome you here today for our program. I am joined by my colleague Becca Biggs, Director of Communications, and also behind the scenes at the moment, Irena Foster, who is our Guest Services Manager, and Beth Shreve, who is our Marketing Associate. This summer, OJMCHE has the distinct opportunity to exhibit Chim, Between Devastation and Resurrection. And today we have the pleasure of hearing from Ben Shneiderman, the nephew of photographer David Chim Seymour, who will be speaking about the life and work of his uncle. However, before I introduce Ben, I would like to take just a quick moment to acknowledge that this summer is the museum's 8th year in our home here on Davis Street, and we continue to be so grateful to our supporters, our volunteers, our donors who simply could not do the work that we do without you. If you are currently not a member of the museum, I really encourage you to consider joining today. Membership revenue is vitally important to our institution as it supports all museum activities, ranging from exhibitions to education programs such as this one today, to general operations. There are some wonderful benefits that come along with membership, including a statewide reciprocal membership program that includes 16 museums and attractions around the state of Oregon, as well as our Central PDX Cultural Pass that provides single visit guest passes for 4 individuals to visit our cultural partners, Lansu Chinese Garden, Portland Chinatown Museum, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and the Architectural Heritage Center. An additional benefit for some membership levels is a reciprocal membership program that includes access to 12 Jewish museums around the country that is available through the Council of American Jewish Museums. If you have any questions regarding membership, please don't hesitate to ask myself after the program, or Irena Foster, or our staff downstairs. And now let's turn to Chim. Chim, Between Devastation and Resurrection, presents the work of distinguished photojournalist David Chim Seymour, born in Warsaw in 1911. His keen observations of 20th century European politics, social life, and culture, documented the beginnings of the anti-fascist struggle to the rebuilding of countries ravaged by war. Chim was drawn to the struggle of workers' rights, countries in transition, and post-war resistance and survival. In 1947, with Henri Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, and George Rogers, Chim founded the Magnum Photo Agency. Chim, Between Devastation and Resurrection is on loan from the Illinois Holocaust Museum. The original exhibition, this exhibition was excerpted from, we went back, photographs from Europe, 1933 to 1956 by Chim, organized by the International Center of Photography, and made possible by the John and Anna Maria Phillips Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. The museum gratefully acknowledges the Arnold and Augusta Newman Photography Fund of OJMCHE for supporting this exhibition, and in addition, thank you to Ben Shneiderman for his additional support. It is now my pleasure to introduce Ben, who will speak about his uncle. Ben Shneiderman is an emeritus distinguished university professor in the Department of Computer Science and a founding director of the Human-Computer Interaction Laboratory at the University of Maryland. He is a member of the prestigious U.S. National Academy of Engineering and has received 6 honorary doctorates in recognition of his pioneering contributions to human-computer interaction and information visualization. Ben.
Closer to the audience. Hello, good afternoon, Portland. I'm very pleased to be here and pleased to see you here. And thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to come attend, see the exhibit and the rest of the museum. I appreciate Gail's mentioning and thanking people. I want to add thanks to my friend Ira Wagner. Ira, where are you? Who's now here? Where's Ira? Are you smiling? Oh, all right. Ira Wagner, who introduced me to Judy Marbles, the previous executive director of this museum, and she worked wonderfully fluidly with Illinois to bring that exhibit that was a big success there at the Holocaust Center in Illinois, and showed for a year over there. And so we're able to install it. And appreciate Alicia Babstein and the other staff and the really nice installation that's done downstairs. So I hope you'll take a little time, a little reception afterwards here, and I'll be glad to chat. I'll be around, and I'm here to answer questions and tell more stories. And the story goes back, it's an important one for me, about my uncle, born David Chim in Warsaw, Poland, 1911. And that's where the family starts. So my parents, I'm named after my grandfather, Benjamin Chim, and then David and my mother were two children, Eileen. So Warsaw was an interesting story at that time, but soon enough, by the early 30s, my parents, seen here on the lower right in a picture by Chim, a lovely picture in 30, and Chim with my mother came to Paris where the action was in those days, the socialist movements, the Front Populaire, and if you followed the French election 2 weeks ago, the Nouvelle Front Populaire continues those traditions of labor-oriented socialist left-wing thinking. But at the time, that was where the action was. If you weren't thinking socialist, you weren't part of the current movements in the 1933 period. So my parents married, came to Paris with my uncle. He was studying at the Sorbonne, picks up a camera and goes to work photographing the workers and les arts, the butchers and the fruit makers. And he photographs my mother around Paris in these stylish outfits. And he was there, as I say, as a student, and then he began to work for a photo agency called RAP. And that's what he looked like in those days. The Paris of the 30s was the hotbed of activity, of worker movements, of socialist and left wing. And the picture on the left is a national strike for a 40-hour week. And the disarmament, anti-war pictures were typical. Interestingly, these posters are in English, although this takes place in Paris. And these, cheering, singing singing while the parade walks by. And if you notice the hand, the visual literacy, the hand representation, that's the left-wing Front Populaire, as opposed to the Nazi salutes. And if you notice, the picture of Trump last week was like this, which was sort of ironic, sort of a mixture of cultures and imagery of the time. But Chim's work was very influential in Paris, and he began to publish in the French magazine Vue, Regards, and so on, and chose the short name Chim, C-H-M in block letters, Bauhaus style, blockish letters as his logo. He then went with my parents to Spain in the 1930s to photograph the action of the Spanish Civil War. And so he started by being a war photographer. Those were the images that people wanted. But his passion and what he became known for is his stories about the refugees of war, the backstories, and how here many of the refugees traveling across the Pyrenees coming together to escape the violence that was surrounding them. So it goes on, and this picture, which is downstairs in this format, was maybe the most iconic. It became a celebrated one when a magazine put it on the cover, photo montage, a Luftwaffe bomber dropping bombs above her. And so this is mistakenly captioned even downstairs as a bombing during a German bombing attack. It was a labor union gathering in Extremadura in Spain. And this picture became celebrated around the world. It was one of those first iconic pictures. Chim and his buddies, Robert Capa, Henri Cartier-Bresson, you may know these other legends of photography, believed that a single photo could change the world. And sometimes they succeeded. So it's an interesting story. So here, this image, cropped this way, became very celebrated. For all my years, we knew of the photo, but we didn't have the negative. And where was the negative? In 1938, Chim and Capa, Robert Capa was born Andre Friedman, also Jewish, in Budapest, and they came to be buddies. Chim was a little older and took Robert Capa as a sort of brother into Spain, and they photographed together. Kappa was a much more dynamic, action-oriented guy who's known for as the world's world's greatest war photographer. He took the pictures of the Normandy D-Day landing that you see just in the last few weeks in the 80th celebration. You'll see those on the covers of many magazines. So the two of them worked together, and they had a studio in Paris, and they knew that they expected the Germans were coming and that these photos of Spain would be in trouble. So they packed up 5,000 negatives, put them into a couple of boxes, into a suitcase, gave it to the French consulate, and who went by bike somewhere to Biarritz, I think, and then onto a boat and to Mexico, where there was a welcome appreciation for the Spanish refugees of the Spanish Civil War. And then they disappeared for 70 years. So there were many efforts to track them down. Robert Capa's younger brother, Cornel Capa, who took over this effort and became the executive director of the International Center of Photography, put advertisements, sent words out through the photographic circles all around Mexico. Nothing, 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 until in the mid-90s somebody said, I have the photos. My aunt died, and she gave me this suitcase, and there were 2 boxes with these negatives. Well, that led to another 10 years of negotiations. Cornell sent some emissary down to Mexico City. They were to meet on a certain restaurant at a certain date on a certain time. They never showed up. Finally, the connection was made to the owner, and the movement to bring this to New York, the International Center of Photography, began. But there were problems. The Mexican community of photographers said, no, this is Mexican. You have to leave these in Mexico. We don't want it to go to New York. Eventually, we prevailed that the families deserved to get these photos back and brought to New York, where they were given attention and curatorship. Cynthia Young, who's curator for this exhibit, also took care of the Mexican suitcase. And as she went through the unrolling these spools of 35mm film, with great care, a special instrument was built by George Eastman House, and they scanned all of these images without cracking the emulsions, and this picture emerged. And so the full frame has a very different story. It shows the socialist masses rather than the heroic individual. Okay, and so you get the contrast of the ways these become interpreted. When the Mexican suitcase arrived in New York, the Sunday New York Times Arts and Leisure, the entire front page was all about this story. The exhibit was done in New York, and there's a movie, a 90-minute film you can see called The Mexican Suitcase, which tells the story about it's a pretty interesting story about the war, the recovery. I appear in that film briefly, and it's pretty well, if you're into photography especially, or the Spanish Civil War, it's well worth looking. So the Spanish Civil War was a sort of seminal moment for Chim, where he became not just famous in French circles, but a worldwide fame because of pictures like this. And after the war, he came, well, he went on assignment from Spain on the boat SS Sinai, a famous story that appeared in Life magazine, showing the refugees fleeing Spain to Mexico, arrives in Veracruz, spends some time in Mexico, trained to El Paso, trained to New York, and he comes to New York. And my parents arrived in New York in February 1940 as well. So during the war, Chim becomes a naturalized citizen. He takes the name David Robert Seymour. Robert Capa, his good buddy. There's novels about the two of them. Martha Gellhorn, one of Hemingway's wives, wrote a book called 2 by 2, which is a novelistic version of Chim and Capa, and tells the story of their brotherhood. So that's quite neat. Chim goes into Camp Ritchie in Maryland, becomes one of the Ritchie boys, 13,000 Americans of mostly European descent who spoke the languages of Europe, German, French, Spanish, etc., Italian, and they were trained for intelligence. And Chim served during the war as a intelligence officer for aerial photography in England. After the war, he goes back to his photography, picks up his camera, and with his buddies Robert Capa, there with a cigarette on the streets of Paris, and with Henri Cartier-Bresson, they formed Magnum. Now this was an unusual alliance of very, I've written that one of Magnum's strengths was the diversity of its founders. So you have very different approaches. Henri Cartier-Bresson is sort of from a well-off French family and a very careful, gentle guy who became famous for his photographs. And then the outrageous Robert Capa, who dashes into the war scene, famous for the line that if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. And in the Spanish Civil War, the famous picture of the dying soldier, a bullet in the head, which many people suggested was fake, but actually turns out to have been a real one. Lots of controversies and stories emerge, but these three guys pull it together and they form Magnum, a cooperative which exists today still. So from the 3 or 4 of them, George Roger was an early participant. It's grown to 85 photographers who are still cooperative members and about 65 staff, so it's a pretty substantial organization. There are now about 20 estates. I represent my uncle on this, so I'm part of that Magnum circle, and that's a day or 2 of my week is spent dealing with requests and issues that take place. So Magnum's become a leading place, and Chim was a key figure in launching it, became president, and then the tragedy of Capa stepping on a landmine in Indochina and being killed in '54 left my uncle as a key figure there. Henri was more in France, in his own world, but Magnum continues to exist in New York, London, Paris. It's interesting maybe to note the differences in the way their diversity of personalities also was reflected in their photography. So my uncle's work, if you look at the pictures downstairs, you see he made an empathic relationship with his subjects. And in many of them, if you ask yourself what happened in the 30 seconds before this picture, you could imagine him walking up, showing his Leica, looking at them, asking for permission, getting their attention, and composing the picture with them as partners. So he was very much part. And Chim, echoing Capa, might have said, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough emotionally to your subjects. Henri, by contrast, was a very different personality. He wanted to be invisible. And he would take his Leica very carefully out, click, and put it back away. If you look at his pictures, many of them, the subjects are not aware they're being photographed, or they're taken from behind. They each, of course, learned from each other and tried each other's style, but if you look at the body of work, I think you'll find these 3 different styles are a pretty strong case for how that happens. One of Chim's most famous projects was done for UNESCO, who sent him for 6 weeks traveling through 6 countries after the war, and made this booklet called Children of Europe. And it was to show the orphans of war. So UNESCO and UNICEF, the Children's Fund, were the promoters of this. And this is one of the pictures. It's another sort of motif that appears in many pictures. Children dancing in a circle. It's a lovely one. And we don't see that much anymore in the streets of children dancing like this, but that was kind of the thing of the time, these other children climbing in the ruins of war. The many pictures from this series, there are a few downstairs, show this, these children struggling, orphans, and this overly cute picture on the far left. Photo editors recoil from this one. It's just too cute to be real. But to me, I like it. I always had that hanging in the hallway of my home because I just like that sweet look. These others, this set of boys over here, it's pretty remarkable. Again, think about the relationship issue. Here you've got these 10, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. And they're not smiling at the camera. They're all pretty much struggling, but every one of them is looking at the camera. It's pretty amazing. If you've ever taken a picture of a bunch of kids, getting them all to focus, and somehow Chim had the capacity to bring them together. So that image, and this one of this girl holding out her empty cup, is typical of the picture. The most famous of those pictures is downstairs here, Tereshka, who was asked to draw her home, and so all she could manage was the scribble on the board. Very disturbed looking face, troubled. But, you know, if you look at it, there's a sense of hope, because clearly she trusted Chim. She worked with him to make this picture. She allowed him to make this picture. And that's a telling story about Chim's capacity. But this image has become the cover of books about here, the cultures under siege, collective violence, orphans of war, trauma, many psychological books about normal behavior of children. So it becomes this cover. So I get to see these because normal licensing from Magnum goes automatic, they take care of it, but if there's something like a book cover, I get to approve that this book and this topic are a place I'd like my articles work to be shown. And Magnum has a strict no cropping policy and no editing, and you can't put text over it. So anytime there's a modification, like even that curve or cropping of the image, I get to say yes or no. Another one of the stories from Tereshka, I get contacted by a German philanthropist who this was at the time of the Rwanda War, and he set up a foundation for the orphans of war in Rwanda, and then across all of Africa. And he asked me to use the Tereshka story and the name to make it the Tereshka Foundation for Orphans of War. And of course I agreed, and he put that to work. And so that's another way in which a photo has this kind of impact, because it evokes that kind of empathy, and it builds willingness to participate in making the world a better place. Let's just put it that way. On the right, the scribbling part on the board has been extracted to, in a little novella, Carol Nagar, who's a poet, a writer, but she writes a little novel, a fantasy about what happened in the moments before, the time before Tereshka and Chim met together. The Tereshka story also invoked a pair of Polish investigative journalists who tracked down Tereshka. And this was funded by this George Siegenbaum, the philanthropist, to help them find. And there's a film you can get to see about how they tracked down Tereshka. Tragically, although it was often reported she was a Jewish orphan of war, no, she was not. She was Polish. She had been injured by shrapnel, and she was mentally, PTSD and worse, and eventually died in a clinic. But these journalists tracked down her surviving brother, and after many wrong Tereshkas, they tracked down every Tereshka in an orphanage, and they followed up thoroughly together. So there's many things that, it's interesting to me what triggers people's interest, where their passions go. The stories continue. This is a slightly different, another shot from the roll, and this one's in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and it got a full story in the Washington Post 5 years ago. David Seymour's post where a photograph of Tereshka captured little girl's heartbreaking response to the notion of home. And so that's, to me, I just watch how these things happen. It's just fascinating. If you want to take a look, there's a nice 8-minute video about children of Europe. It's on Vimeo. There's actually several by now that tell the story about the children of war. And the Children of Europe. The Children of Europe book triggered American support for the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, including Germany. So again, the idea of a photo having an impact, you can't prove these things, but the sequences of experiences and stories and people's restating that gives you some idea.
Chim went on to work, photojournalism for major newspapers, Life and Illustrated and This Week magazine. Traveled widely, began to go to Israel in the 50s, 1951, came every year. The one on the left is one of my favorites, this teenage woman with a rifle on her back going out to sentry duty at an Israeli kibbutz. So the determination and the self-confidence of this woman speaks to me as sort of an inspiration about her. And on the right, the proud father. This was an Italian Jewish kibbutz where he held up the baby, the first baby born in the kibbutz. It's a circumcision gown, but it was a girl. And at some point, the BBC tracked down both the girl and the father and did a story about that. And this picture is used, sort of the great pride of parenthood shows through, and corporate advertisements have used it, the pride of the new product, as the variant of that. But the emotional stuff really rings true. And there again, ask yourself, what happened? Did this person know that Chim was taking the picture? Yeah, of course. He was showing the baby. He was proud. And he wanted that recorded by Chim in that photo. This is another one of those great photos of Chim's sense of timing and his arrival in a kibbutz. Here's a chuppah for a Jewish wedding, held up by a gun and a pitchfork. I mean, this is just perfect. In fact, it's so good that one writer accused it as being staged. He couldn't believe that, what is this going on? A kibbutz wedding, and this, American photographer shows up and just happens to be there? They didn't believe it. But I don't think that happened. I don't think it was set up. I think this was all the way Chim and Kappa worked. They worked fast with the Leica cameras, which gave them the flexibility to move, and that changed the nature of photography. But that's one also that I've always had hanging in my house. These others, Chim went on to photograph personalities who were very much eager to have him Toscanini with the death masks of Mozart and Beethoven. Very, very. Bernard Berenson on the lower left at the Borghese Gallery in Italy, in Rome. And of course, Picasso, 1938 at the Spanish Pavilion at the French exhibit space with Guernica in the background. And here's, I guess I don't know my time. I think I'll tell one story here. So last year, I get an email. As some of you know, we've now moved to Vancouver, Canada. And so I get an email. I was giving a talk about my uncle at University of British Columbia. And I get contacted by 3 art historians who have just written an article about this picture for an art history journal. And they believe the following little sequence, which was that that Picasso saw Chim's photos in the publications of the time, and that screaming woman looking at the sky is really this woman. Okay? It's not quite an exact match, but you could sort of get the idea of the nursing mother. Actually, in Guernica, there's 2 such women. One, this is on the far right of the picture, the other on the far left. And they looked and they tried to document the day-by-day work of Picasso in making this and tried to match it with when these photos appeared in French publications, and could he have seen it? There's no clear, obvious case. But they say, furthermore, it's not an accident that Chim took this picture of Picasso under this, it's about I don't know, 1/10 of the whole Guernica. Chim, they conjecture, said to Picasso, come over here. I want to take a picture of you in front of this part of the Guernica. And so these 3 authors are charmed by the idea that a photograph inspired a painting, which inspired a photograph. So my historian friends who follow this, they say, well, that's a sort of good fantasy, but there's no, from a historian's point of view, there's not enough evidence to make a claim.
From an art historian's view, okay. So that's kind of a fun, things that still unfold. Oh, here's what, I need to move on, but here's what I care about. So Peggy Guggenheim, you know, Guggenheim family, her father was Benjamin Guggenheim, who died on the Titanic. And young Peggy gets all this money, and she goes to Europe as quite the hippie traveler and starts buying $5 paintings by Braque and Picasso and Modigliani and so on. Anyway, she has this fabulous collection. If you're in Venice, take a look. And this picture, this frame is a smiling one. It's a rather sour one with her dogs. She always had dogs. And at her gravesite, next to the graves for all the dogs, you know. So, I get a call from Magnum one day in New York. They say, "Hi Ben, there's going to be a new one-woman play on Broadway about Peggy Guggenheim, and they want to use your uncle's photo for the publicity." I said, "Great, that's very nice." I said, "Why are you calling me?" And she hesitates a little, and she says, "Well, what they want to do is they want to colorize your uncle's photo. This is strictly against Magnum policy, which is why they had to check me." I laughed. I thought, it's pretty good. In fact, the person who's really a guy, Frank Ritter, a New York artist, has been doing this kind of colorization in the New York Times, New Yorker, and elsewhere. And I liked his work, and I thought, oh, this is pretty cool. It's sort of a bit of pop culture. I said, yes, but you must stipulate and be clear and all that this is where it came from and where the original is, and a link to the website and all that. And she says, okay. I said, great, Diane, thank you. She says, one thing more. They want to substitute for Peggy Guggenheim's face the face of the actor who's Mercedes. So I laughed again, and I thought about it, and I said, "Nah." I said, "That sounds cool. That's fun. I'm in." So that's what the poster looked like. But I said to Diane on the phone, "But wait, I have a little request too. 4 tickets for opening night." So Jenny and I go to New York, and there we are. There I am anyway. Jenny took the picture there in front of the poster, and we saw the play and visited with Mercedes Rule, who was the actress. So that was a pretty nice story. Other celebrities were Sophia Loren, who Chim photographed, and she enjoyed having his photographs. It's just lovely pictures, very casual, and they developed a good relationship. And this sort of outrageous young Sophie just posing in the kitchen corridor of this Rome apartment. No Hollywood publicist would ever allow that kind of picture to go these days, but these kind of things happen. And on the set, after the war, a lot of Hollywood productions were made in Europe where costs were cheaper and there were interesting personalities, and so Chim went, and there's this kind of, she had to sort of instruct him how to do it, and this sort of charming, alluring figure is kind of dramatic one, including the negative space, the white triangle at her very narrow waistline, sort of shows you the picture. Ingrid Bergman was a regular subject of his, and whenever she had children or family events, she would invite Chim, and there's a letter online, you can read the archive, which she writes to Chim, "I make beautiful babies, you make beautiful pictures." And she was asking for more prints and asking them to come back, and so there was a nice story there. So this picture on the lower right at the Cannes Film Festival, which honored her, was about 10 years ago. They blew that up on a sheet, cloth about 85 feet high, and it fluttered over the Cannes Film Festival for a week. Joan Collins, Kirk Douglas, Audrey Hepburn was another sort of one that he and many other photographers really, Audrey Hepburn had a very special charm, especially for these male photographers, mostly men, but for the women photographers too. Maria Callas, an opera singer, was another subject that tells you the story. Gina Lollobrigida, who died last year, and Chim with Marilyn Monroe at the 21 Club of Manhattan. So that's kind of indicates the kind of circle that we have. And here's another celebrity, me.
with my sister and my mother in New York. So Chim photographed that. So that's kind of a particular treasure to me. And Chim tragically was killed in Suez in '56 while photographing for Newsweek. These show the stories. Here on the right is two guys in a foxhole. The one on the left contacts me several years ago and says, "I have your uncle's last photo." He describes my uncle driving up in his Jeep with Jean Roy, a French photographer, and asking directions. It was 4 days after the armistice, and they were going to a prisoner exchange. It should have been safe. But, this guy gives him directions, and then he takes out his own camera and gives it to Chim, and says, "Would you take a picture of me and my buddy in our foxhole?" Which Chim does, and hands him back the camera, drives off, and he described that 20 minutes later, they hear gunfire, and that Chim had been killed by the Egyptian machine gunners, and it's a tragic story that my mother heard about in the morning news. So, my only brother, having survived the war, now was killed in this unnecessary and tragic moment. So the field, the American flag over Chim's coffin and the French flag over the Jean Roy's coffin was a sad, sad ending. But the stories go on because his work continues to influence, inspire, and shape people's thinking about photography, about human life, and so on. Chim loved doing pictures of the religious festivals all around Italy, and he did a whole book about the Vatican, which was one of the early books that he did, including some color imagery, which was quite a rare thing. And this early book on Chim highlights one of the pictures of the Italian Festival of Snakes, where these children are playfully, with a snake. These other books, I have just a copy here. This one is really skillfully done by Tom Beck, and it's a short biography with 55 images, and the captions are especially rich and good here. Just flipping open, there's the same one, and a lot of the pictures that became iconic were ones that were shown. The Mexican suitcase triggered the exhibit at ICP. Remember, 2007, we recovered these after 70 years, and then Cynthia Young makes the exhibit, which produced the film also. And there's one more side story that I put out for you. This is kind of my fun time these days. My father and mother, working as journalists in the Spanish Civil War, wrote about the incidents in Yiddish. And at the time, there were 60 daily Yiddish newspapers across Poland. And his articles were syndicated, I don't know how many places, but he was known. And the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts, labels him the world's first Yiddish war reporter. So they do this in 1930. This book was published in Warsaw in 1938, Krieg in Spanien, War in Spain. Okay? And my Yiddish is poor. It's hard. I've never been able to read that book of their stories that tell a story, including 10 images by Chim. I have a book, a copy that's, just decaying away. It's just every time I open it, just pieces flake off. So, remarkably, 2 years ago, there was a Polish translation published in Warsaw, which gets a fabulous review in the Polish edition of Vogue magazine. Go figure. And last year, it published in Spanish translation in Madrid. And last week, this appeared. I've got a copy to bring to you today. And Gail tells me there's 5 copies in the bookstore. And so this is fresh from the Yiddish Book Center. It has a publishing arm called White Coat Press, translated by Deborah Green, a retired lawyer living in Miami, Florida. And in the back, there are the 10 pictures of Chim, and there, I think you can see it, the nursing woman is, of course, part of that. But you'll see other stories in there, and now I've finally been able to read my parents wrote 85 years ago. So that's been pretty special for me. So the Mexican suitcase and the Spanish Civil War have come alive again. Many people see the alliances or similarities with Ukraine, and so there is renewed interest in the Spanish Civil War. Okay, a few more stories. The We Went Back exhibit was, the ones down here, is derived from the 2013 exhibit that Cynthia Young put together. It's her text that you'll see on the wall downstairs. And this became another success story. And this image was on the cover of This Week magazine. You may know as, if you think back, the Sunday newspaper supplements was inserted, was that. And so that brought, again, widespread attention to this story. And although I find the title We Went Back a little awkward, it does tell the story about returning to Europe after World War II. And Chim worked with the Magnum groups, other people, to photograph the resurgence of Europe, return of travel, return of some kind of normalcy. Cynthia's work and that exhibit produced the book on the far left. Is that going to work? No. There we go. All right. And then this other book, Chim, Children of War, Carol Nagar told the story of UNESCO. And in fact, that will be the subject of a full exhibit next year at Toronto Metropolitan University. They have a place called the Image Center. It's Canada's leading center for photojournalism. These other books were also smaller versions of I shouldn't say it all, but less known stories about David Seymour and his writing. There was an exhibit in Tel Aviv at the Tel Aviv University, the Diaspora Museum. My sister and I both spoke there. It was quite a beautifully installed exhibit, and it was made more remarkable because the curator here with my sister, Asaf Galai, a filmmaker and a photography curator, we uncovered at Magnum about 100 color images of Israel 1951-3, which were quite a sensation at the time. So this exhibit in Israel, excuse me, made full use of those. And hung it in creative ways with these panels hanging from the ceiling, as well as images projected on the floor and ceiling in other places. So that was quite a nice event. A version of the exhibit traveled to Amsterdam, and so that was, out then. And that same year, Paris put up the plaque for Robert Capa and David Seymour for the studio where they worked in Paris, where they packed up the Mexican suitcase. So that's kind of a nice piece. The National Gallery of Art, my job has been to donate the vintage prints to various institutions, museums, International Center for Photography, George Eastman House, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and the National Gallery of Art in Washington. There's a wonderfully written story about David Seymour's humanist photography, the portrayal of his humanistic approach, which has influenced many in Magnum, especially the women photographers, I would say, Mary Ellen Mark and Susan Meiselas, photography, particularly derived from Chim's approach to photography. Carol Nagar's 2022 biography is the latest, deeply researched, poetically written. So if you're really into it, it's a deep story you might want to go to. You can, if you want more, the Chim website. I did prepare a little handout with some links. If you pick up one of these, they've got all the links to the website that I maintain. That tells the story, it has the videos and the writings that have been made about Chim. And the Library of Congress has become really, since ICP has been, I would say, more struggling in its post-COVID times, I've now renewed my connection with the Library of Congress and donated a large set of remaining vintage prints to them. and spoke there in October. So all these things are quite fresh, and to me, very satisfying that the continuing interest. And now we have the exhibit downstairs, and the next agenda will be the Image Center. And I hope to work on traveling the exhibit as it finishes here in a few months. We'll already be looking for other places to show it. And that's the story of my Uncle Chim. I thank you for your time, your attention.
I have a
Questions?
Quick question. The cartoon image of your uncle's visage.
Oh, yes,
that's
I'll prove
on
that.
everything that you
Yes.
have. What's the story about that? Did he do that himself?
No.
Or was it done after?
You know the name Carlo Levi, Italian writer and painter, who my uncle traveled with and did this book. They did not stop at Eboli. Eboli is a southern Italian city and very, very poor section of town. And UNESCO sent my uncle and Carlo Levi to travel there and write the story about their efforts of adult illiteracy training, or literacy training. So if you can see, I don't know if I'm trying, I just have a small image, but the cover of that, of the book shows an old, wizened, wrinkled hand writing A, B, A. I don't think I can enlarge this version here. But if that book's recent, that book's just a few years ago, because they uncovered that archive of all the work. So Carlo Levi was a painter as well, and he did that little sketch. And that little sketch became used as a logo for prints for Chim's work, and through ICP became sort of embossed onto the cover of that. But good spotting, thank you. Other questions? Yes?
How much of his work was colored?
A small fraction. Only in the later years was color. Did Kodachrome become reasonably good? There are a few in this exhibit, but it's, and if you look, you'll see also there's a projection which goes and shows some of the Normandy beachhead things. There's a few thousand only, so I mean, a very small percent. Cynthia Young was planning to do an exhibit of Chim in color to highlight the color. It's a great dilemma because, maybe just to comment, well, these color ones, the celebrities, so the Hollywood people, the publicists wanted color. And these were shot with a Rolly. You see, you'll notice also some of the images are square in format, which was the 6 by 6 centimeter Rolleiflex. And some of them are the 24 by 36 millimeter, 35 millimeter contact sheets. So you'll see, I would say those prints downstairs, they're pretty outstanding because many of them come from a tiny little 35 millimeter print and they're blown out 4 feet by 6 feet. It's pretty stunning. Very, very nice work. Nice work, really good. So these color things require a great deal of retouching to get them right, because the 3 dyes of the color fade differentially over time. And so when we found the ones, the Israel ones and these others, they had to be seriously manipulated. I mean, we're talking about a half a day of work by someone to clean up one of these photos and put the color balance. Still, these color balances are not bad, but some of them are this one is not great. The one of great, even this projected version is okay, but those reds are a little bit too intense, and the facial color is not quite right. So there's still, and different people have taken a crack on it. So the color is an issue. They are historically important and interesting. They are problematic. You'll see one down in the exhibit here of a parade in Israel where people parading are wearing green shirts. They were wearing blue shirts, so careful what says I hear, but that's the way. Yes, another question.
I have a pretty loud voice. How did you say he saw his own work?
How did he see his own work? Well, I mean, it's really speculation. He did not write a great deal, so we don't have that. What we have are the commentaries of others. And what's startling, as told to me, that a British historian who went through some of the archives that are at ICP in New York, there's a whole box of the, what do you call the letter? When Chim died, was killed, there were all these letters written. What do you call these? Not obituaries. Eulogy, but letters that were written and support. They tell a remarkable story. And this historian says, look, I've looked at many boxes like this. I've never seen anything of the great love people had for Chim. He was a quiet, gentle character. Carol Lagarde describes him as a chess player, an owl. You know, in the opening of Carol's book, the first 2 pages are really wonderful characterization. So he was a gentle, quiet person as opposed to the bold Robert Capa. And so he was the soft-spoken, quiet owl of a person, a chess player, who knew good wine and liked to dress well, and was always wearing his, this tie and jacket. This is Elliot Hurwitz, that 3-piece or a sweater, and always dressed well, and he knew the best places to eat. All around Europe in the restaurants and the hotels. He stayed last year at the Danieli Hotel, which we knew to be his favorite in Venice. So it's interesting to track what he did. Your question is hard to answer. I would say, he believed he was trying to tell the story of these people. And he was emotionally connected with them. He had a passion for what he was doing. And all of the Magnum photographers who knew him just, his photo still hangs at the entrance of all Magnum offices. And those who knew him I'm always welcome, in a warm way. So I can only convey that indirect answer. Is there something else you were seeking?
I'm just imagining because of your family, that maybe he spoke to them more informally, so you had a sense of how he really did see himself.
Well, my sister, who's older than I, had more of a relationship with him. She describes as a 16-year-old him taking her out and teaching her what a young woman, what kind of wine to order, what kind of cashmere sweaters she should have, and how she should comb her hair. She has very sweet stories like that. But I can't really give you an accurate historian's answer. I think he worked very hard to create the community. I think it's significant, again, that Magnum still is a cooperative. And it was these photographers working together, owning their own rights. And the story that they wanted to own their own rights was really important. Because if you worked for Life magazine, it was work paid for hire. You took the photographs, they got the negatives, and that was the end of it. You had no control. You had nothing to do. And the idea was the photographers wanted to do their own stories, and they wanted to own it, and so they would do it for Life magazine, would pay for their trip and for the photo. And then they could sell it in London and Rome and Paris as another version of the story. Not the same images, but other versions, other images from that same story. And they masterminded this way in post-war time of creating an alliance of photographers who then owned the copyright, owned the negatives, and could decide what happens to them and where they were used and prevent them from being misused. So it remains a challenge, those issues of preventing them from being misused. I don't know, I don't think I want to go into it, but there's a lot of challenges that they have. Other questions? I see his hand, yeah.
As far as you know, did your uncle himself ever follow up or learn anything of the subsequent lives of some of his subjects, the ones who are anonymous to us?
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I mean, they were struggling, all of them, they were struggling to make a living and to keep this organization going.
So there wasn't a lot of time for this casual kind of exploration. There were people like Ingrid Bergman he returned to repeatedly, so yeah, he had that connection. But mostly he was working and struggling to keep going, so they had to find the money. And remember, it was not just working for themselves, they had to make the money for the staff. That's still the issue. I mean, I have been paid from Magnum for 2 years for my uncle's work because they're short of money. And they've decided, you know, that the young photographers who are, some Magnum photographers are very successful and doing just fine, you know, and the young photographers are truly struggling. So each year at their annual general meeting, they take in 2 novice photographers who are candidates for Magnum membership. And if after 2 years they do okay, they become associates. And after another 2 years, they become members with voting rights. So it's a well-orchestrated, highly controversial process because hundreds of photographers want to become Magnum photographers. And so they have to decide how to make it. So the estates have become another story. The estates are now about 20 of them. And we have our own little group, but we don't really have a vote because under the cooperative rules, only the working members. So there's 15 to 20% of Magnum's income is through the estates. And so we're sort of working to see how, well, we are getting a representative on the board, but there's issues that the estates have different needs than photographers. Well, talk to me later. Anyone else? Other question? Or it's party time. Thank you again.